So today we're going to be talking about AI in course policies. And we encourage you to log into your computer so you can follow along and try some of the things as we do it. And we also encourage you to copy these slides. You can either take this URL in, and then it will give you the option of saving them to your Google Drive. Or you can either type it in or in your camera add the QR code, and that should allow you to do the same thing. And there will be some references at the end that we link to from within here. We also encourage you to log into your AI tool of choice. It could be ChatGPT, it might be Claude, it could be Microsoft Copilot, it could be Google's Gemini, which I would recommend. It's in pretty bad shape right now. Although they're changing it by the day, I try to make it work a little bit better. Or any other AI tool that you're comfortable with. And if you're not, you'll be more comfortable by the end of the hour or by the end of the day if you attend some of these others.
Give everybody one more second. All right, we'll probably keep going, but pop a line in the chat if you need us to go back at any time so that you can get the QR code and the link. So we're going to kind of talk generally about why, if the camera's over there, I don't know why I'm looking at the projector. We're going to talk a little generally about why it's a good idea to include some kind of syllabus policy first, and then we'll get into some more of the nitty-gritties. At this moment in time, and there have been some other sessions that talked about this, but like right now, all faculty still have a lot of autonomy regarding like where you stand on these sorts of issues. So like how much generative AI use you want to permit in your course or not. So like right now, the intellectual integrity policies that we already have in place are applicable to basically any kind of generative AI use, right? I mean, if you think about copyright violation, plagiarism, cheating, and fabrication and falsification, all of those categories of the intellectual integrity policy do cover like generative AI, because generative AI tools can do all of those things, right? So it's really up to you as far as like what kind of policy you want to craft in regards to how you feel about these tools and how your students, what your students are permitted to use or not.
And this is all really new right now.
Yeah.
In fact, you're experimenting. We're going to be living in a world in which AI tools are ubiquitous, and our students will be. And faculty have adopted a pretty wide variety of techniques to address this issue. But one of the most important things is that you be explicit about this, that you be transparent about what you allow and what you expect. Some classes will require students to use AI throughout the course on most things. Others will ban it on most things. And it will depend in large part on what your learning objectives for the course are.
Yep. And then just to piggyback off of that also, some of the feedback that we've gotten and that we've had in conversations with other colleagues, if you pull back for a minute and you think about the students who are in your courses, they're going to be, taking 5 different classes with 5 different faculty who all have 5 different feelings about like how these tools should or should not be used. And like, while in our heads, it makes sense to us, right? Like what's okay and what's not. they're gonna get mixed up, right? And like John said, because it's something that's changing all the time, it can be tough for them to kind of keep up with all of these sorts of things. So that's why we feel especially that it's important for you to be really clear about what's okay and what's not, so that they're not as confused. And they might ask you throughout the semester, like what was that again? Especially if your policy is kind of in the gray area where sometimes it's okay and sometimes it's not, which we'll talk about later. But it's going to be hard for them to keep track of it. And I know like my students have talked about how they're really nervous, to violate whatever our policies might be, right? Like some people are going to cheat regardless, but a lot of students really don't want to. And I think that it's really stressful for them, especially if, it's kind of a gray area. They want to do the right thing. And they're looking for our guidance on that, which is why I think this is another really helpful thing for us to do.
In syllabus statements, which we'll be talking about more shortly, one way of addressing it, you should include some statement about AI use there, but also be sure to do it in each assignment because oddly enough, students don't go back and check their syllabus on a daily basis. And again, with different expectations in every course, it's really important to remind students when AI tools can be used and when they are not allowed. And put that right in the assignment instructions. Part of that tilt approach. Transparency in learning and teaching, which is useful anyway, because with many issues, faculty have different expectations, and making those explicit are really helpful.
All right, so one of the things that I did a couple of semesters ago was I started experimenting with the general AI tools because I wanted to see what my assignments looked like if you were to input them, right, like into like any of the tools. So, I have found that most of my students have been using ChatGPT because I teach writing, depending on what your discipline is, it could be a different tool of their choice, right? So, but it's not a bad idea to kind of experiment with a couple of the different ones to sort of see what happens because different tools have different capabilities, right? So, I spent a little bit of time kind of messing around with ChatGPT in particular. I stuck with the free version because it felt most likely to me that most of my students were going to be using the free version. So when I started experimenting, I started doing a couple of different things. One of the things that I did was sort of copy and paste my assignment, like word for word, into the generative AI tool so that I could see what it would produce. In my brain, that's what my students were maybe like most likely to do first, right? Just like throw the whole thing in there and kind of see what would happen. And then I kind of started playing around with some variations of that, right? I started adding in a little bit more material that we would have talked about in class. I tried shortening the assignment a little bit. I tried writing it in my own words, right? So I tried a couple of different approaches for how that would go. John, do you want to talk about that piece at all?
A couple things. One is that AI tools have evolved quite a bit. The free version of ChatGPT, version 3.5, where I think now Pro is available.
For most of it, yeah.
Not nearly as powerful as it was 6 or 7 months ago. They've made it a little bit more efficient, but it's become a lot less powerful in answering queries. But Claude, on the other hand, is much more powerful in the free version, and the paid version is even more so. So you may want to experiment not just with ChatGPT, but also Claude. And a year or so ago, Chegg was a year and a half ago, Chegg was extremely profitable as a source of academic dishonesty. Its value, the value of its share price has fallen dramatically. I think it's fallen by about 25% in just the last 6 months, and I think by 60 or 70% over the last year and a half or so since the introduction of ChatGPT. Students were paying $17 a month for access to Chegg to get things to be able to keep pretty easily. I wouldn't be surprised if many of our students are paying for the paid versions, which are $20 a month. So it's about $2 more a month than what many students were paying for Chegg. So, you may want to also consider getting a paid version of either ChatGPT or of Chegg. Or of Claude. And the paid version of ChatGPT version 4 is remarkable. If you have it on your iPhone, you can have nice conversations with it. You can ask it questions, and then it will follow up by asking you questions. And it's much more in the quality of the responses. If you had played with AI tools 6 months ago or a year ago, the quality of responses have gotten dramatically better, or at least with the paid versions of these tools, and even the free version as well.
It's also worth mentioning too that many of our students might be using these tools kind of like together. So for example, they might use ChatGPT to generate something and then run it through another AI tool like Claude, or maybe use something like Quillbot or the Hemingway app, right? And use something like that to kind of help them summarize or generate, right? And then they could put it through another tool to kind of like see what the comparisons are. So that's worth keeping in mind also, that it's not just a one and done kind of a thing within one tool. They can kind of combine the tools together, which then gives them more options, but then also makes things even muddier in a way, right?
And I see 3 people arrived in the last couple of minutes, so I just put a link to the slides in the chat. You can download a copy of those, and we'll be using some of the links in there as we go.
So as we keep going, right, like after you've done some experimentation with the different technology and you can see what range of responses you might get to your or you might get for your assignments, think about reviewing your assignments, right, and seeing what they're capable of producing for your course. So like I would go through and put in assignments, and it's fascinating, right? Like a year ago, many people in the English department were saying like, well, here's what we can do, right? We can ask our students to like just write reflectively, right? Because it's from their own experience, and generative AI tools can't make that kind of stuff up. But they really can, right? Like it's amazing, like what this kind of what can be generated, right? If you've ever played around with it and asked it to create like a personal essay for you, right? And if you put in like a nugget about like how you overcame some sort of like obstacle, and oh, can you use a metaphor to describe what it was like to overcome that obstacle? The tools will create all of that kind of stuff for you, right? So take some time and like put your assignments in and see what the tools can do well, but then see also how they're lacking. And that can be really helpful. One of the things that I found that worked pretty nicely for the assignments that I was doing in my composition courses is that the assignment was layered. So I had them do an analytical essay that had a couple of components. And I found that the generative AI tools did well with one part, but not so well with both, right? Like it couldn't approach like a multi-layered question as efficiently as like something that was much more straightforward, that just had kind of like one pathway to answer. So I thought that that was a really helpful exercise, because then I could kind of see what the limitations were, but also what I had to look out for, you know, like as I was giving these assignments.
And one of the things that's really helpful is making clear to students why it's helpful for them to learn specific skills. Because if they don't see why they're doing things, and that they see our assignments as a series of hoops they have to jump through, it's pretty easy to say, well, I'll just let an AI tool do this for me. But if they think they're learning skills, and if you explain how they're learning skills that are going to be helpful later, they're at least somewhat more likely to try doing it themselves. And, you know, if you integrate, as Stephanie suggested, if you integrate AI tools as part of the assignment, you can ask them to turn in a lot of the interactions with it, and then you can have them reflect on it, although again, AI tools can reflect on that, so you've got a little meta layer there. But you could also do other things with it, where you ask them to, for example, interview some historical figure in the discipline, or something similar to that, where you're interacting with it in some, where they're interacting with it in some way, where they're demonstrating what they know through the specific interactions that they have with it. So that's a topic more for other sessions, but we do have to motivate, we always should motivate why we're giving students specific assignments, but it really helps if we can fill that in.
I also think, just to, John, would you mind going back to the previous one? Sorry, I was on like the other one and I'm a mess. So like, I also think it's important for us, right, as instructors, because they are looking to us for guidance with all of these things. So tell them, how much you use or don't use these sorts of tools, right? Like that transparency between us and our students is really, really important. So, and like, I'll tell them, hey, like I used it to like help me do this. Like I really like generative AI tools for brainstorming and for outlining. I find that to be really, really helpful. For other things, I find it to be less helpful, right? And I'll give them examples of, like other ways that I've sort of tried ChatGPT when I felt that it kind of fell flat, One example that I was playing around with the other day, I was messing around with the Hemingway app, which is like a tool that supposedly makes your writing like a little bit more concise and, like easier to read, whatever. So what I did was, and it will, like the Hemingway app will highlight different parts of your text for you, right, in different colors. So like if it's purple, your sentence is way too long. If it's pink, then you've used an obnoxious adjective. You know what I mean? Like it will highlight different things for you. So I asked ChatGPT to generate like a 250-word passage, and just like about whatever, right? And I asked ChatGPT to include like 2 errors, like one really long sentence and like one obnoxious adjective. And I put it into the Hemingway app, and the passage was totally highlighted in different colors. It was purple, it was pink, it was orange, it was red. And there were problems like all over the place, like according to this other tool. So it's really interesting, right, to kind of like chat with your students about like the benefits of this, but also how things could be a little bit contradictory. And sentences that like I personally had absolutely no problem with, this other app was highlighting as like really problematic. So you have to have, like John was saying, like we have to have some of our own expertise and some of our own like authority when we're writing. And I think it's so easy to just rely on this other stuff, and then we lose like the pieces of ourselves that make us unique and interesting. And our students, I think, need to know that, right? Because they're already like not sure about their own abilities.
One caveat though is when Stephanie mentioned introducing some errors, they were not technically errors, they were poor writing.
Yeah.
If you ask ChatGPT to introduce grammatical errors or spelling errors, it will refuse because that's one of the guardrails built into it, which is one of the ways I think many of us started to recognize that students were using AI more for pretty much everything in our courses, that we were suddenly getting grammatically correct and with correct spelling in discussion posts and other things that weren't always there in the past.
Yep.
Students have to explicitly modify that to add their own errors. But certainly you can ask it to have long sentences or include specific adjectives or other things in it.
Yep. Talk about the rest of this? This one we should talk about, I think. Well, we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. And like where we're going to go next, right, is thinking about, all right, so what are the levels of acceptable use, right, like in your classroom, right? So that's where we're going to kind of go next, but I'll encourage you to think about, and on the sheet at the very end of this presentation, in addition to all of the resources that we have, we've also included how to cite generative AI tools in Chicago style, APA style, and MLA style. So even like making like the citation practices available to your students, but also, just showing them like, hey, listen, like if you are going to use these tools, right, there are guidelines. So you want to make sure that you follow those guidelines, just like we talk about citation in all the other ways, right? I mean, papers are being published and ChatGPT is being included as one of the authors, right? So think about like what that means, not only for your discipline, but for the students in your classes as they are maybe using these tools.
And one difference with these citations is that they're treated as personal conversations because they're not verifiable in the same sense that citations in journal books and other things are. So the citation styles reflect that basically.
For sure.
It would be similar to a conversation with an author or something similar.
Yep. So most of the syllabus policies and course policies that we've kind of come across so far fall into like these 3 categories. Don't use it at all, right? And like we mentioned it on one of our previous slides, but like if you personally do not want your students to use any AI tools, then like they might ask you why, right? So be ready to tell them, like, well, this is why I don't want you to use it, because in this class, it's very important for you to critically think in this way, right? Like in this discipline, like it's unlikely that you're going to be using these tools like at this time, right? So I'm not going to teach them or whatever, right? But they might ask you like, well, why not, right? Like, because we all can do what we want to do with them, right? So either no tools are allowed at all, some tools are allowed in some situations under specific contexts, and that's where, like John mentioned earlier, and something that I started doing, because like in my courses, I said you can use it sometimes. So like in addition to having the statement on my syllabus, I started throwing those statements on every single assignment. So, and they were all a little bit different, right? But I explicitly stated like, here's what you can do. This is okay. This is not okay. If you do this, then you will receive an unfavorable grade, right? So if it is sometimes, make sure that you're extra transparent about what that means, because that can be really confusing. Or like tools are allowed, right? Just make sure that you cite them. So those are the three categories that we've generally kind of like fallen upon.
Jose Bowen, one of the authors of one of our reading group books in the fall, on a podcast last week, made the argument that basically the type of output generated by AI tools today would be essentially D or F level grades and so forth, and that we should expect more from our students, that if all they're doing is generating things by typing a prompt into a program and they don't do anything further with it, then they probably they really haven't learned very much. So that's a somewhat more extreme position than most people are taking, but it does suggest that we're going to have to change the way in which we do things somehow. But, we're not going to be able to avoid student AI use. We can't roll back the clock and prevent these tools from being available. And they are tools that we're going to be using forever, or at least for the foreseeable future, until maybe a nuclear holocaust or something, when they'll all go away.
Can I ask you a follow-up question about that, John? Did he say like, you put something in and like you get a generated output and then that's it? Like, did he talk at all about
basically
refining it after the fact?
That should be the starting point.
Okay.
And then they should build on that to do more higher levels.
Okay.
To do more critical analysis and so forth.
Yeah.
That we should expect students to be using these tools, and we should try to get them to go further, basically.
I'm excited to listen to that podcast.
Was
John has all the insider info.
Teaching in higher ed podcast.
Nice. Nice.
Maybe 2 weeks ago. Well, and at the bottom, there are some links to some sample AI policies. And we also have some additional references here. Well, should we go to the sample AI?
Yeah, probably, I
These
think
were
so.
created by Rachel Quest,
Mhm.
at SUNY FACT2, who is one of the people working, who was one of the PIs on the IITG grant that we received, that we'll be talking about more in a later session.
So what we would like you to do, and this is a couple of pages long, so we're going to give you a couple of minutes to think about this, but we'd like you to go through this document. You don't need to read the whole thing, you can skim. But it's basically kind of broken up into a couple of different categories, and all of the categories are bolded, right? So what you've got here is a collection of different course policies or syllabus statements that are all related to generative AI use. So some of them are like permitted with citation, and you can look at the language that says that. Some of them are permitted like occasionally, sometimes, but not other times. And then some of these statements say that generative AI tools are not permitted at all. So what we would like you to do is take a couple of minutes, I don't know, maybe like 3 to 5, and go through and kind of skim through this document and find a policy that like you like, and then we'll ask for people to share which one it is and maybe talk about what you like about it, what you would add, what you find lacking, or like if it's perfect the way it is. So basically kind of go through this and like react to it. So we'll give you between 3 to 5 minutes.
Further, we do have this reference, which has a whole collection of syllabus statements from various colleges, including collections from specific courses. So, feel free to browse that, but see if you can narrow down on some type of a syllabus statement that works for you.
So we'll come back together in about 4 minutes. Let me look at my watch so I know when 4 minutes is.
I wasn't able to access the link. Is there any way that I can copy it?
Yeah, it's right in that, if you downloaded the slides initially.
I was not able to do it.
Okay, we can go back. It's this, let me go back to the end. Well, if you go to the slides, the link is right in there. So if you grab this, that will have both links. The links to the Uniata specific course policies, as well as the link to the college and course policy, link to various other features, basically. And while people are doing this, if anyone has any questions or comments or thoughts on any of this, please feel free to unmute or type something in the chat. Something in the chat. The policy, if you download the slides that are on the screen, the links are right on the pages. Okay, and Liz has put in a link to it. Those are the policies from SUNY FACT2 that were shared by Rachel Fest at the AI symposium we had last week. For ICIT, I forget which. Any other thoughts or questions or concerns as people are browsing?
I would note too, as we look at policies and think about what AI can or cannot do. I would say for the group here may not do it, but I found one thing that really struck me with AI use is when I was asking for problems that require a bit of calculation. So things about the time value of money, internal rate of return. AI would return these step-by-step solutions that are beautiful and then the wrong number for the answer. And so I couldn't figure out why they were walking me through how to solve the problem and then come up with a number that was completely wrong until I actually did put it into, I think Claude and ChatGPT, the free versions is what I had been using. And they walk through, the general equation, how you would input the data in the question, and then they would come up with an answer that was numerically just incorrect. 13% instead of 8% or, something like that. So that was, so, I mean, it's interesting. There are other applications that do solve those pretty easily, but,
That's a good point, Liz. And I think, like, I obviously don't teach a class that does anything with numbers, but, just thinking about I think the value of inputting like your different stuff just to see what gets generated for us, I think is really, really helpful. And I mean, it's fascinating, right? Like I was reading something the other day that, you know, suggested that more of our students, like within like the next 5 years, are going to turn to generative AI tools to like give them the news. Right. Instead, I mean, in addition to social media, which is where they get the news now, but like, you know, like thinking about like how, you know, like I'll go to Google or I'll still watch the news, right? But like how like this shift is sort of happening and what that means for the information that's kind of coming across these platforms and how it's going to be consumed. But I think your point is really, really valuable, right? Like just considering what is being generated and what our students are seeing, I think is really helpful for us to know.
But I wouldn't be too comfortable with the errors in that the error
No.
rate in mathematical calculations actually increased over the evolution of ChatGPT, the free version. But if you try the paid version, it's a whole lot better. And
Okay.
these things
Right. Well, I don't really, you know, I don't really rely on these are the mistakes they make and I can design around it. I'm just, I'm saying that's one of the ways I got a heads up to its prevalence in my class. Is I was like, you know, usually when people were getting these wrong, they have to show their work and you sort of see the step where they input something wrong or they misunderstood what the question was asking for, right? And so I got this puzzling, why did you beautifully lay out the steps to solution and give me the wrong solution? And that's, so, I mean, I would just say sometimes when you start to have this baffling pattern in your class of where did that happen? That's basically been the answer.
Yeah.
And if you start getting emails from students, as most of us probably have, I hope this finds you well as the first words of it. That's almost certainly generated by ChatGPT. I got a lot of those with a large class at the end of the fall semester. Students I had never heard from and many I hadn't seen for most of the semester, suddenly hoping that they found me well.
Well, they were worried because they hadn't seen you for such a long time, John.
We also had averages like 2 or 3% out of 100 in the class, and they were wondering what they could do in the last couple of days to recover from it.
Does anybody else have one of the syllabus statements that you found helpful or interesting or terrible?
Yeah, I already have a syllabus statement where I basically said, you know, where I allow it sometimes, and I kind of set the parameters. I had these bullets and all of that. And I guess too, I think what really helped me in talking with students when I suspected use or whatever was one thing I have in there is like, basically I said, look, it's fundamentally dishonest to present something as your work when in fact you really outsourced a big part of that work, whether it's to a machine or another person, right? I said it's fundamentally dishonest, and this is why it's not going to be allowed, and this is why there are consequences for it. But so, I mean, I think in my policy, I really broke it down into things that you know, they could sort of understand. I said, do not use AI to just give me a full response to questions or prompts in any of your graded work. If you don't write a response, don't copy and paste a response from another party and claim that you wrote it. This is clearly dishonest. And so I think I started out this discussion of AI in class by just saying, you actually know this is dishonest. You know, this is a shortcut, right? That is really basically outsourcing some of the work that you would have done in the absence of this tool. So let's pretend that it's not, and then decide how to use it effectively. And
yeah, Jessica Harris. I was looking at the one where it was some generative AI tools are allowed. But it brought me to kind of a question for both of you. You know, when you were mentioning, Stephanie, about putting in your assignment into AI and seeing what it produces, it made me start to think about, you know, how to kind of incorporate the benefits of, you know, AI tools, but ensure that our students are demonstrating their own understanding and skills and not kind of over relying on AI generated content. So it makes me think a little bit about my own assignments. And if you guys had any advice about, you know, how to kind of think more critically about the assignments we're creating and producing when it comes to AI, any thoughts on that?
So my response is going to be very clearly from a humanities standpoint. So forgive me. But like one of the things that I've always done is in all of the assignments that I give, whether they be for like an English composition course, where they're working on writing essays, or for, you know, the poetry classes, is to try to have my students be able to connect to the material in some way, shape, or form, right? So for me, and I've been trying to do this, you know, before AI was a thing, right? But I found that my students inherently value what we're doing if they can somehow connect it to something that they know or something in their own lives, right? And I totally understand that that is something that is not possible for every discipline, right? Like I'm very, very, I think, fortunate to be able to take that approach in a lot of ways. But for me, it's been really, it's been nice seeing them, I don't want to use the word care about something, but like be interested or be passionate about something for whatever reason, and then use our class to kind of dig into that interest and really explore it a little bit more. And it's also worth mentioning, Jessica, that like, not all the students in my classes, you know, have wanted to use these tools, right? And I think for us, thinking about that part is just as important, right? So like, I had some students, you know, in the fall semester who, like I introduced the tools in class. It was like my first big semester, like really doing stuff in class with AI. I was super excited. I thought everybody would be really excited. And I had like a handful of students in a 20-person class who were like, I don't want anything to do with this, right? Like, I want to do my own writing. I think these tools are problematic. I think that they're, you know, and they gave me reasons. So I think if you do decide to incorporate them, you should be ready for some students who don't want to do it. And I mean, that's your call as to like, if you want to say like, well, do it anyway, or if you want to say do it without. But like, I think that we should be ready for that too. But anyway, aside from that digression, I try to give them assignments that they can connect to in some way. And that has been very valuable to me over the last, I don't know, long time, for a while.
Some of you have heard this before, but in my online classes for about 8 or 9 years now, I've been using this reflective discussion forum where students reflect on their learning and make connections to their lives. And that helps quite a bit. Again, all that could be done by AI, but it's probably easier for them to do it themselves and come up with a prompt that would be consistent, because it does also build a bit of community where the students get to know each other a bit more. And, you know, if they suddenly change occupations or if they change other things in their background, that would look really odd. And it's much easier for them to maintain their own persona, or whatever persona they choose to present in those discussions. That's one way in which it brings in the same type of thing. But, you know, the other point, and this is one again that Jose Bowen has made in a number of different forums, is that, you know, we had these same concerns when spell check was introduced on computers, when Grammarly became available, when Wikipedia became available. And now these are just tools we know everyone can use. And AI tools are not going to go away. The same arguments came out when calculators were introduced in schools. I remember way back when I was in high school with teachers arguing that students will never learn how to take square roots if they can have a calculator. And that's true. Students no longer take square roots by hand because they don't have to. These are tools that can allow students to build on knowledge from the past. It's just a question of what can we do to get students to go beyond that type of output. And, you know, it could be used to potentially expect more learning from our students because they do have access to these tools. Now, that's a challenge, and it's going to be much more challenging in the STEM fields than it is perhaps in other areas to get that sort of personal connection. But, you know, I think it's going to require a lot.
Yeah, go for coffee.
What was that?
That was me not muting.
So it's a challenge, and it's going to be a challenge that's going to evolve quite a bit as these tools become more powerful, because not only is Chat 4.0, GPT 4.0 rolling out already to people, they're going to be gradually rolling out the Omni version of it. And one of the things that in terms of detection made it easy, not just with mathematical errors, but also it would make up citations. And GPT for Omni doesn't make up citations. It actually searches the web and it will provide links to the sources as you do it, which is pretty impressive as a tool. So, you know, some of the problems there are gradually going away. Hallucinations can always occur by the nature of large language models and generative AI, but they're going to become less severe as the tools develop.
One other thing too, Jessica, to kind of circle back to what you mentioned that I did also, you know, last fall was, you know, if you do decide to permit like some use, right? Having students document their process, I think can be really helpful in a lot of ways, you know, whether it's including the like having your students include the exchange they have with ChatGPT or whatever, so that you can kind of see, like I encourage my students, you know, because again, I used it in my classes a lot for brainstorming. That's what I like it for the most, you know, and my students, I think, found that to be really, really helpful. So if you have them include their exchanges, right, and then say, how did this exchange, right? Like have them reflect on the exchange, right? Like have them reflect on what happened. Or, you know, like have them show you, like one of the example statements was, you know, like include the exchange, highlight what you found most relevant, describe what tools you used, explain how you used your tools, right? Which is something that, like, so for me, like in my writing classes, I have them do the assignment and then I have them write about doing the assignment. So like, just think about, you know, if you are going to permit it sometimes, what those steps are going to look like and outline it. And honestly, like some students in my class said, you know what, Stephanie, like I decided not to use AI because like the process that I had to go through to explain to you how I used AI was too much work. So I decided to just do it. And I think that's fair, right? Like, so, anyway, I think that's enough.
But one other suggestion is, you know, there's always going to be some, in most disciplines, there's going to be some issues that are debatable, where there's different viewpoints. And one thing you could ask students to do is to engage in a debate or an argument with one of these tools where you can see what their arguments are and then how the AI tool responds and how they respond to that response. So you can get a whole dialogue going on where they're interacting with it and they're demonstrating their knowledge through that interaction. So there are ways in which we can use this productively, I think, in most disciplines. One thing I experimented with in terms of economics was giving it a prompt of, let's say, asking, Claude works better for this, asking Claude to play the role of David Ricardo, for example, and then have the students ask it to analyze or to discuss the Biden's trade policies and current trade policies with our tariffs with China, for example. And then you can get a whole dialogue going on where students are, you know, using what they've learned with what they know about the Ricardo's views on these topics. And it gave some pretty interesting results.
Oh, got somebody that raised the hand.
Okay, so yeah, Ashraf. You see my hand raised?
You're muted, Ashraf. You're muted.
No.
Okay, my apology. Thank you so much, John and Stephanie, for the insightful presentation. That's very interesting. Here, you know, from an administrator perspective, you know, I'm a department chair, and I believe that not so many of my colleagues in the department are having, you know, like they have the academic integrity policy that's general by the university, but it's not in the syllabus. Okay, so now we are in a transition space. Okay, so what would you recommend that I would do? So like in the department meeting, I bring it up and spend time on it. Do we try, I looked because we have certain cases, you know, like of academic integrity, you know, like, so it is, you know, like in the course syllabus, what I know is that the course syllabus is the contract between us as instructors and the students. So I'm very happy with listening to this. I'm going to attend as well the 10 o'clock session as well. That speaks about ethics. I don't know whether I should defer that to that time, or so what would be done from me as my responsibility as a department chair with my colleagues. So should we, should we bring it up so that we can discuss it further in open discussion and see where we take it from there? I know that we are under the School of Business. I'm the chair for marketing and management. So this is one thing. The other thing is, what's about artificial intelligence and all of that? It's quite new. I know that the students are always ahead of us, and in terms of, and then we are trying to adapt to that. So if a faculty does not have a policy regarding, you just spoke about, here are the 3 alternatives, and it would be good to be explicit about it, no use, or use it within certain, as you just mentioned. So, the clear question now is, if a faculty did not put an artificial intelligence policy, just put the academic integrity policy in there, and then the students come and use it, whether they admit or not that they use it, that they use artificial intelligence or not, the faculty try to do their most diligence in order to just make sure that it was not that they did not use AI, and then it brings in a narrative from artificial intelligence, ChatGPT. So how do we relate this to academic penalty, academic punishment, academic, we have been using the word dishonesty. So what would be my role if there is no something explicit, one of the 3 things that's in the course syllabus at this point?
I think the first step is to make sure, or to encourage everyone to put in an AI policy statement in their course syllabus. It could be part of the academic integrity part, or it could be somewhere else in the syllabus, but make explicit what students are allowed to do in the course and what they're not allowed to do. And also, again, encourage faculty to put that on all assignments, so that when students are given an assignment, they're told whether or not AI is allowed or not. If it's not allowed anywhere, reminding students of that is not a bad thing. If it's allowed in specific ways, as Stephanie suggested, for example, make that explicit in those assignments. So, it's really important that students have some understanding of this, because students who would like to use it might feel discouraged from using it, because about half students report concerns about using it, even when it's allowed in classes in national surveys. On the other hand, over half of students use it regularly in classes, whether it's allowed or not. But making that explicit is really important, I think.
And then I'm going to say this, but take it with a grain of salt, and I'm going to have John verify whether or not this seems to be true. And then I have one other thought for you also. But my understanding so far, as I've been listening to the different conversations about intellectual integrity, is that without some kind of statement on your syllabus, like about how an instructor feels about generative AI tools, right? If a student does, violate that, right? Like, let's say that a student uses generative AI to produce an essay, but there's no statement on the syllabus, that makes the reporting to the dean's office a little bit more difficult.
Well, it's always difficult if AI is if the only thing is some type of verification, some AI detector, for example. Those are notoriously poor in terms of their ability. Now, they do a pretty good job with, so that's a topic for other sessions.
Okay, yeah.
But in general, it's going to be difficult to detect AI. Even with the AI detectors out there, they have a very high failure rate with non-native English speakers, for people for whom English is a second language, the failure rate on that is extremely high. They give a lot of false positives. So a number of schools have introduced policies where AI detectors cannot be the sole evidence of academic integrity violations. So it's difficult to prove unless the students admit to it, which is true with a number of other different forms of academic integrity violations. But the most important thing is that the instructor has a policy that's explicit and students are reminded of that.
And then I'll say briefly, because we are just about at the end of our session, but and I know that this is a big statement, but while I was at CIT, I went to a few sessions that talked about this. Some departments that, have like multiple sections of the same thing. So I'll use English 102 as an example, even though we're not currently doing this here. But, like some departments at other schools have kind of gotten together, the instructors who teach those courses, and sat down together and said, hey, we're all teaching English 102. Let's kind of align our AI policies, right? So that at least all the students who are taking English 102 are on the same page. That is a big thing. It's an easy thing to say out loud, but it would be a big thing to do. But some other schools are doing that at this time, right? So that would be something to just think about, right?
But it's going to
With the
be
big
tough
thing.
because
Yeah.
this is an evolving area and
Yeah.
policies are going to be evolving over time. It's going to be hard to get consensus unless you just happen to have a group of people who agree on things, which tends not to happen.
It's true.
in academia.
Yeah.
In community colleges, it's very common to have those policies because it's a much more top-down decision where they have, where there's one person in charge of the course. They essentially set policies for everyone. They all adopt a common book. They sometimes have common syllabi and
Yep.
common course cartridges and so forth. That's not how, things
Yep.
tend to work here. And there's really not a lot of consensus on this now. So the most important thing, I think, is that as a takeaway, maybe that faculty experiment with these things and try using it themselves to see how it might be used by students in their discipline beyond here. Because these tools are not going to go away. And, we do need to prepare students for the future that they're going to have, not for our past. One of the issues that always comes up is that we all think the best way of teaching anything is the way we learned it ourselves. And we do need to prepare students for their futures. I mentioned that a few other times, but we should be preparing them for the futures they face and not our past, basically.
All right. I think we're at the end.
Well, thank you for joining us, and we'll be back with another session shortly.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're going to have